Thank you very much, Peter, for being here with us today. I know it's been a busy time for you, given the timing of your new book, Habermas, public intellectual and engaged critical theorist, which is all about trying to show how Habermas's philosophy of the public sphere hangs together with his role as a public intellectual and should be understood in tandem. And for the Philosopher, which is a journal of public philosophy, this is, I think, a very apt way of paying tribute to Habermas and his legacy. As Isabel mentioned, the work of Habermas is enormous. So I think we're going to sort of try and focus it as much as possible on this question of the public intellectual, his role, and Habermas's kind of understanding of the public sphere. So let's start with you giving us a kind of brief analysis of the main thesis of his earliest work, which informs much of his later work as well, the structural transformation of the public sphere. What does Habermas understand by the public sphere, and what is his main argument about it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for being here, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to sort of talk about my book, but also to celebrate the life of sort of one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. So Habermas, in Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, this was his first book, as you mentioned. It was also his most popular and I think his most influential, something that he would often sort of remind his readers. And when he signed my copy, he mentioned that and then in parentheses put a kind of self-criticism in, right, to sort of make the point that sort of this was kind of in some sense the highlight of his whole career. And I think the interesting thing about this book is that it really is divided into two parts. In the first half, Habermas really takes us on a kind of historical, sociological, and normative journey, where he basically argues that in the bourgeois public sphere that arose out of sort of the salons in France, the coffee houses of Britain, and the so-called Tischgesellschaften in Germany, that this period in the 17th and 18th century, what really happened was that sort of there was a new phenomenon of individuals from different spheres of life, from different walks of life, from different social statuses, were beginning to come together in these common spaces that were neither sort of the private sphere, which was the sphere for him of the economy, right, of personal self-interest, nor was it the kind of political sphere, which to that point was really the sphere of the court, right, of sort of the king and his courtiers around him. But this was a new public sphere where sort of these individuals had common interests in what the state were doing, because in part, these were the early stages of capitalism, so they were interested in what the state was doing abroad. They were interested in weather abroad because they were making investments, but also increasingly because levels of education were rising, people were becoming more literate, they were able to really come together and recognize each other through a kind of common ideal of humanity where they could speak with each other, both about politics, about economics, but also about art, literature. And in the course of sort of this historical phenomenon, this sociological phenomenon of recognizing each other as part of a common public, as individuals, they eventually then also developed the ability to sort of see each other as part of a common public that not only was able to sort of monitor, but also criticize the sovereign. And Habermas really sees this as the origin of sort of public opinion, but also the public as a powerful force in politics. So that's the first half of the book. The second half, then, is in many ways what the Germans call a Verfallsgeschichte, right? A sort of a history of decline, where Habermas, writing in the early 60s, most of the book was actually written in the late 50s, is really telling the story of how this ideal, right, when it is an ideal, he recognizes all the problems with it, right, that it was a sphere that was primarily still dominated by the reading public, not so many workers. Although the salons were hosted in large part by many women, right, it was still a largely male-dominated sphere, a European sphere. He recognized all those things, but what he's saying is that this certain ideal that arose there relatively quickly actually starts to be undermined. And in talking about this, he starts to talk about how these early publications, which initially had been really about sort of rational discussion and debate. Eventually, those publications become newspapers. Those newspapers become corporate conglomerates. And the advertising interest, the sort of economic interest starts to take over the kind of public function that they initially had. And in the second half, he really becomes that person, he becomes almost skeptical of the idea of this ideal of the public sphere that it's even able to function anymore. And I think this is interesting because sort of these two halves, the more constructive first half and this kind of more critical second half, in some sense give the book its real fruitfulness and its potential, because it can ground both an ideal but then also ground critique. And I think that these two sides also explain why, for instance, the English translation did not come out for 30 years until 1989. And that was because Habermas increasingly, in sort of toward the late 1960s and into the early 70s, had become skeptical of how strident his critiques in the second half of the book were, and wanted to emphasize more as the sort of constructive potential of the rebuilding of post-war Germany as a liberal society, as a democracy. But then towards the end of the 1980s, he was starting to become more concerned, and he was starting to realize that maybe the critical aspects were something that he wanted to once again play up. So I think sort of these two sides of the book really give it its force and potency, and really allow you to have so many different interpretations, and really, give it this ability to ground all sorts of future critical work, not only in philosophy and political theory, but also in sociology and literary studies and in a number of other disciplines, right? Communication research, media research, etc.
That's wonderful. So the book is sort of a rise and fall of the public sphere. And as you describe, his later work is sort of grappling with whether there can be a recovery of that sort of original spirit of the public sphere. And he himself sort of struggles with whether that's possible or not, and kind of moves back and forth, and maybe will come more to the kind of declining state of the public sphere when we can maybe touch on social media and how people talk about the public sphere or the public square these days, when people refer to, Twitter and things like that. But let's talk. You said that originally Habermas envisages the public sphere as sort of separate to politics, but then you talked also about the fact that the public sphere becomes a sort of precondition for a kind of critique of politics, of sort of a self-reflection on the state of politics, and that sort of bridges his thinking in when it comes to the public sphere with his thinking on democratic politics, deliberative democracy. Can you talk a little bit about that? About how does he develop his understanding about the political role of the public sphere?
Yeah, so when he's talking about the public sphere in structural transformation, he talks about the political public sphere, but also the literary public sphere and all these other areas. And that's primarily a work of social theory. That obviously has political connotations, but those aren't really spelled out very clearly. It's only sort of after 1989, after the reunification of Germany, that he puts out his first major real work of political theory, that is Between Facts and Norms. And that book, in many ways, I think, can be read almost as a sequel to Structural Transformation, in the sense that it really then teases out the implications of kind of the argument, especially of the first half of Structural Transformation, for democratic politics. And there, the argument he basically makes is that democratic legitimacy in the modern world, right? We are no longer able to sort of directly participate in politics, right? Regular people, in the way sort of the ancients were, right? By attending assemblies and things like that. And Habermas is also very disappointed with the kind of idea, the Benjamin Constant's idea of the liberty of the moderns, right? Where sort of we just maintain certain negative rights vis-a-vis the state and pursue our economic interests, and that's kind of enough. What he wants is a model of participation that could work in the modern world. And he really sees the public sphere and deliberative politics as allowing for that. So there he develops this idea that what happens in the public sphere is what he calls opinion formation, right? So there are all these debates that are filtered through leading media, right? And there he has primarily in mind sort of leading newspapers, but also television, radio, and some of these new media at the time. And they're really supposed to be almost staging debates between the best viewpoints or the most powerful arguments on both sides of each debate. And that's supposed to help the public who is listening to these things, who is then debating these things in the pub or in the new version of the coffee house, I guess. So that's the process of opinion formation that is occurring in society. And notice that that's not public opinion, right? So it's not just sort of being asked as a snapshot what you think, but it's actually supposed to be about debate and really thinking about the issues and being guided by these kind of contributions. And then that opinion formation is supposed to get translated into sort of formal will formation, right? So the actual creation of administrative law that can be coercively enforced through this process that he in Between Facts and Norms refers to this as the sluice system, right? And there he has in mind almost this idea where that sort of these waters, right, of opinion formation are supposed to work their way towards the institutional centers of politics and affect those, right, by sort of affecting sort of what representatives hear when they speak to their constituents, what the representatives are then reading in newspapers as well, right? So the conclusions almost that are being generated by opinion formation are then supposed to work their way into the actual laws that are being produced by parliaments, right, or sort of congresses, by the legislature, and are being signed into politics. And it's that kind of indirect mediated process that is supposed to really be generating democratic legitimacy in a participatory manner, right? Because we all, in some ways, whether whether we follow debates very closely or not, we are all participating in these debates in a sense. And sort of Habermas really thinks that just being around those debates, participating in them, whether it's actually writing, whether it's just reading, whether it's participating through these conversations with friends, that's really what is grounding democratic legitimacy. But for that to work, these sluices have to be open, and the people have to see that their opinion formation is in some sense actually being translated into will formation, so into formal laws and into the decisions that are being made by governments.
Yeah, so that's a very sort of a different way of thinking about democracy as a sort of social process of opinion formation through debate and conversation, rather than a kind of, as you say in your book, a sort of agglomeration of points of views that get expressed in an electoral result.
Right, and I think the important thing that's different about this from public opinion is that Habermas's, I'm sorry to cut you off a little bit, is that Habermas's assumption is that public opinion, I think so often we think of, oh, well, people think this about abortion or whatever issue, people think that. Whereas Habermas really thinks that sort of in these debates, people's views change, that there's sort of that these debates can change people's ideas. And so it's not a snapshot, it's not taking these interests as given, but these things actually are sort of being debated, and that this really is an area where what he calls the unforced force of better argument can assert itself.
So this, you mentioned how all this sort of debate is supposed to eventually feed into the legislative process, through this kind of filtration, through newspaper writing and discussion and debate. And this poses my next question, which is about what role philosophy has to play in all of this, right? So for some people, philosophy is quite removed from the world of politics. It's something that happens in libraries and the ivory tower. It's a scholarly pursuit, not particularly concerned with the day-to-day political debates. So how did Habermas understand? I mean, I understand that he started his career as a journalist, even if very briefly worked for a newspaper. So he clearly had that interest, and then went on to become an academic who would contribute newspaper articles very regularly and systematically throughout his career about the big questions of his time and of our time. But how did he think about the role of political philosophy and political theory? Like, should it be something that aims to speak to policymakers? Is it something that should try and shape public opinion in this kind of way by putting out the arguments and debating? Or should it kind of remain, to some extent, removed from the day-to-day political kind of humbug?
So I think that really gets to some of the core issues that I'm discussing in the book. And I think Habermas, he doesn't have an easy answer to this. His answer is about mediations, and it's kind of indirect process for him. And I think that also comes out of his own experiences, right? I think if we think of the early Habermas in the 1960s, a lot of people will think of the kind of almost intellectual leader of the student movement. But Habermas ultimately broke with the student movement, where he realized that sort of he could not be a movement intellectual, right? But that he needed to assert his independence, and he was very worried about the student movement's embrace of violence. So he kind of comes to be very skeptical of the idea that the philosopher or the political philosopher acting in the public sphere should really be representing a fixed point of view. And I think this is also a critique of a lot of Marxist intellectuals, right, who had to sort of sacrifice their independence and their own thought process in order to sort of represent the views of the party. And what Habermas, the model he ultimately settles on, or is really related to his view of what philosophy can do, right? So almost his meta-philosophy, so what the purpose of philosophy is. And for him, what he calls post-metaphysical thinking, this idea of philosophy after the age of worldviews, that what the purpose of philosophy for him really is philosophers aren't experts at anything really, and they're not, some philosophers talk about being experts in sort of normative argumentation. Habermas doesn't really believe that either. He really sees the role of philosophy as being what he calls a stand-in or an interpreter of sort of all of the other sciences for what it means for everyday life. So in some sense, that you could also see the impact of kind of phenomenology and existentialism, which he was quite into in his early days, on his mature thinking there, right? This idea that philosophy really is about translating sort of what we know about the world and society into sort of our everyday experiences, into what he calls our life world. And so for him, sort of the philosopher in the public sphere is really supposed to be almost this kind of indifferent guardian of the public sphere, right? So intervening in public debates when important voices are not being heard, or when important arguments are being ignored, or even when certain issues that should be sort of debated are being bypassed, right? And so I think the most famous example of this is what gets often called the historians' debates in the 1980s, where Habermas sort of sees that there's a group of conservative historians who are working with Helmut Kohl's conservative government to try to really change the German view of the past and to almost normalize the Holocaust and say, oh, it was just another tragedy of the 20th century, just like the Gulag, right, and like all these other genocides that happened, and really Germany should just move on and have a normal foreign policy and participate fully in NATO, and sort of not be worried about these things. And Habermas sort of comes out into the public sphere and says, look, all of these changes are being made behind our backs, right? They're trying to change the school curriculum and all this, and that's fine if we, as Germans, have this debate and decide that's what we want to do, but this should not be done through a kind of administrative, executive-led process. If this is going to change, we should have a debate about it. So he almost sort of provokes this big debate about what the meaning of the past is. And that's, in some sense, really what he sees, right? The engaged public intellectual should really be should have a sense for these silences, right? And the ability to sort of bring those silences into the open and to bring these important debates into the open. So that, in some sense, really is what he's doing. And he has this essay that he calls an avant-gardistic, It's an avant-gardistic understanding of relevances, right? So this idea that you can see what is important and bring it into the open. And in that sense, right, the primary role, you don't measure the success of the public intellectual as whether sort of their viewpoint wins, but whether they're able to provoke debate and improve the quality of discourse.
So I noticed that in praise of your book, you have Axel Honneth, who writes a foreword, also an inheritor in some way of the critical theory tradition. And what he says about Habermas is, he talks about your book being a unique, light and pivotal figure of our time who may have been, in retrospect, the last classical public intellectual. So I guess my question is, that sounds lovely as a sort of role of the public intellectual. Do you think that Habermas thought that philosophers, as they have developed at least in the Anglosphere, but to a large extent is happening also in the continent now, this increasing specialization, no one has a view on the whole like perhaps, a 19th century German philosopher did, or maybe even this kind of early Frankfurt School figures. In this era where, people are an expert on roles or an expert on this particular subset of, metaphysics or the philosophy of biology when it comes to, this particular type of organism or whatever, can philosophers today, given how the profession has developed, play that role that Habermas wanted philosophers to play as public intellectuals?
In some sense, I think it has become more difficult, right? And specialization is a major problem. I do think that Habermas still thought that philosophers sort of should be able to maintain this kind of synthetic view, and really to understand sort of, what sort of these developments in science or wherever else, right? What those really meant for people and what those meant for public policy, and that they should be developing ideas about that. I don't think that means he thinks that every philosopher necessarily needs to be a public intellectual as such. But I think that for him, sort of, it really was about having that synthetic view. And I think the major problem that he diagnosed later in his career, and interestingly, sort of one of his last books was a short volume that he titled The New Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere in Deliberative Politics. He actually really lays out, in some sense, what he sees as almost the destruction of the public sphere as a result of the rise of sort of the digital public sphere, and in particular the rise of these kind of the change from the idea of having media, right, that really act as a medium, and having platforms that really no longer do any editorial work, no longer sort of really serve the same kind of purpose of filtering opinions, but just throw things out there. And in one sense, that democratizes the whole process. It allows everyone to become an author, right, to really let their voice be heard. But the problem is that it also fragments everything so much that it's almost impossible to generate these big debates that really allow for opinion formation, or even to have debates about even have common debates about what we see as the basic problems of our time, when everyone is sort of in their own filter bubbles and no longer even necessarily in national public spheres that are tied to institutions that can actually generate laws, right, create laws and actually sort of change public policy. And so in some sense, the time of sort of democratic legitimation through the public sphere may be coming to an end because for these kind of almost structural reasons, in addition to sort of the difficulty that maybe we have as a result of ever-growing specialization in philosophy and in the sciences in general. But I think that sort of for him, the bigger problem are these kind of structural conditions and less so the conditions of philosophy as such.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder whether there's a parallel of fragmentation within academia, not just within the public spheres and the media and social media. We'll come to that in a bit. But yes, that idea that there is no coherent way of talking about what 21st century philosophy is doing right now, because there's just so many different things going on. And in some ways it's wonderful, it's pluralist. We have people that continue an analytic tradition. We have people that continue on sort of like a French post-structuralist tradition. We have people doing history of philosophy, but there's no kind of cohesion. And so also, the loss of this ability that Habermas had. I mean, Habermas was one of the few people, notably, who, despite coming from the kind of continental tradition, read very closely his Anglo-Saxon kind of peers, and was in conversation with people like Rawls and Richard Rorty and all that. That seems to have become at least a rarity, if at all existent these days.
Yeah, but I think that the important thing in this perspective, or from this perspective, is that Habermas was in conversation with all of these people. He was actually friendly with a lot of them, despite also having philosophical arguments with them. And it's also interesting that I think sort of despite the major differences between a figure like Habermas and one like Derrida, and this kind of debate that they had in print, in philosophy, is that as public intellectuals, right, they actually, I think, were arguing for very similar things in terms of protecting democracy, in terms of sort of trying to generate debate and sort of make sure that debate in the public sphere was good. And Derrida even co-signed, right before his death, one of Habermas's texts in the bill opposing the Iraq War, right, in February 2003, right? And I think so Habermas, I think, despite the philosophical differences with a lot of these figures, in thinking also about Richard Rorty as a kind of public intellectual or public figure, I think sort of despite their philosophical differences and despite working in very different areas, I think they actually were making very similar kinds of arguments in terms of the public sphere, in terms of really trying to almost continue the Kantian project of encouraging the public and encouraging individuals to make use of their own reason, right, and end that kind of immaturity that Kant famously talks about in his essay on what is Enlightenment. So in that sense, I think as public intellectuals, all of these figures were part of a very kind of common project, despite their major philosophical differences.
You've touched a little bit upon the fragmentation of the media landscape, the fact that it's, now we have social media, we have Substack, people can just self-publish. Before we go into maybe touching a little bit more on that, you note in your book that Habermas shied away from TV and radio, and maybe that was for personal reasons as well. Famously, he had a sort of cleft palate, and his speech was impeded by that, which of course is fascinating given his emphasis on speech as a sort of central part of democracy, humanity, everything. But do you think there's a deeper philosophical reason why he focused primarily on the written word and not on the spoken word?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I think it is connected, obviously. He calls it a personal idiosyncrasy, and I think it is connected to the cleft palate and to the difficulties he had in making himself understood in sort of in the spoken word. And I think that is, in some sense, gave him a predisposition to prioritize the written word. But in Structural Transformation, he famously talks about the written word as the decisive mark of the public sphere. And I think this is where sort of his understanding of the public sphere really differs from Hannah Arendt's understanding of the public realm, right? And Arendt was, I think, a very important inspiration for Habermas and structural transformation of the public sphere. But for Arendt, the public realm is the area where individuals sort of expose their individuality. And it is, in some sense, the space of appearances, right? And it is the orator, the great orator, getting up in front of the assembly and sort of taking over with also the strength of their charisma and not only their arguments. And for Habermas, the public sphere is not that. It is not the space of appearances. It is the space of argumentation, the space of deliberation, to use kind of the terms of contemporary democratic theory. And as a result, right, he really sees the written word as being better because it's not as emotional, right? It's not about sort of whipping people up into a frenzy and being a great orator. It's really about presenting good arguments. And he saw sort of Arendt's model as being too much about appearances, and that was also in some sense what his worries were about television, about radio, and I think to an even greater extent about social media, especially if you think about Instagram, TikTok, right? These are primarily visual media where it is all about appearances, all about how you present yourself. These are media that really don't allow you to have extended conversations or longer texts, right? It's really about sort of short texts, appearance, and that is really the opposite of what Habermas wanted from the public sphere. So I think in that sense, his commitment to the written word was really a commitment to rational argument, and in some sense, almost a desire for him to step away from the idea of the philosopher as guru, or as this kind of teacher of the nation, right? I think that's connected to his experience after World War II as a young student, right, into finding out how many of these philosophers that he admired, most notably Martin Heidegger, had actually collaborated with the Nazis and had kind of misused the respect that they had had as philosophers to kind of support the regime. And so in that sense, he was very much committed to this idea that the philosopher was not a guru. And as I said, he was also burned himself by his association with the student movement, where he almost felt that he had become too much of a public figure and too associated with them. So I think he was very committed to this idea that the written word was the area where the philosopher as a public intellectual could intervene with their arguments and convince on the basis of their arguments alone, right? As a citizen, convince their other citizens that sort of a certain topic was important, that a certain perspective was worth paying attention to and should be sort of followed in public policy.
It's quite funny because the way you were describing him just there, and something you mentioned earlier as well about his sort of skepticism around philosophy as a sort of expertise of any particular kind, sort of reminds me a little bit of a, Socratic streak in Habermas's thought, right? About philosophy being important because it poses the right questions, questions that people haven't thought about, undermines assumptions that people take for granted. And at the same time, of course, Socrates extremely skeptical of the written word, focusing on the oral, tradition, whereas Habermas kind of, on the opposite side of that.
Right, but I think sort of despite the differences over the spoken versus the written word, I think this idea of the philosopher as a kind of, in their public role, at least as a kind of gadfly, I think is very similar. And in that sense, I think Habermas was called the kind of the Socrates of the Federal Republic, right? So in that sense, I think that idea that they are supposed to take uncomfortable stands, right, and really ensure that sort of all perspectives are being given a fair hearing is really what is at the essence of Habermas's idea of what a public intellectual is and does.
I mean, given his view on the importance of the written word and what that allows versus the world of appearances, which, as we've said, is sort of even more amplified. Forget TV. TV now seems like quite a tame medium compared to, social media and Instagram and TikTok and all that. I mean, it's a pretty damning verdict on the state and the health of the public sphere. I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about us transitioning to a post-literate society where people just don't read anymore, let alone write. I mean, the only sort of exception to the way that we've talked about the contemporary sort of state of affairs would be something like the long form podcast. But we also know that that comes with a whole bag of its own problems, given some of the main kind of representatives in that space and how they use that medium. So, but is Habermas giving us the tools to think that we're living at the end of the kind of public sphere in the way that it would enlighten democratic dialogue, and we have entered a period where most of what is being expressed and most of opinion formation is done in these very crude, appearance-driven media, not sort of not driven by long-form written essays.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that Habermas, right, as I said, the second half of Circular Transformation really provides this history of decline and is already a critique of trends in the public sphere as they were occurring in the 50s and 60s in the Federal Republic of Germany, which I think if we look back now, using Habermas's own criteria, would probably appear to us to be, in some sense, very close to the ideal. But I think that is, again, is precisely what makes Habermas's work so fruitful, is that he gives us both the kind of tools to think normatively and to construct ideals, but also the tools to think about how those ideals are not being met, and how we might be sort of coming to the end of them. So I think in that sense, right, this kind of, those two sides of his work, the critical side, but also the constructive side, and the ability to sort of think at any given point in time and sort of to almost capture the shifts in the balance between those two things, and to engage in this kind of process of what he called a Zeitdiagnose, so a diagnosis of the times, I think is what's really powerful, and I think is what makes his work so relevant to thinking about our contemporary condition, not only today, but in some sense at any given point, right? No matter what the trends are, I think Habermas's work on sort of diagnosing the bad things also gives us ways to think about ways forward and sort of ways that we can try to recreate under new conditions, at least some of the sort of desiderata of what a good public sphere would be.
Okay, that's great that there's a glimmer of hope there, and maybe we can talk more about it in the Q&A with our audience. I'd like to turn a little bit towards some of the main critiques of Habermas, right? So as far as I understand them, they're sort of two almost in opposite direction critiques, and you start your book by sort of addressing one of them head on, which is, you know, Habermas has this kind of ideal theory of what communication is like in the public sphere, and it was only present for that small moment in time, and now we've lost it. And so the critique is, well, that's you know, if that's your political philosophy, it's way too removed from the real world of politics. So you're not really diagnosing politics as it is, and so if you're not really understanding it properly, you're not going to really be able to shape it or change it either. And the accusation is, you know, you're being overly rational. You're modeling politics on a university seminar room, you know, where there's this kind of set of equals that all respect each other and kind of engage in very civil debate, and, you know, really trying to give the best argument and are open to being convinced otherwise, and so on. So you start your book by saying that critique is very unfair, misunderstands this project. Why is that?
Well, so I think but his project as a philosopher, and this idea, the kind of communicative action and the power of speech, I think for him is really about the implicit assumptions that we have to make when we engage in linguistic interaction, right? So for him as a philosopher, if he looks at sort of what speech does, right? As linguistic beings, when we interact, whether it's talking about the state of the world or trying to organize our actions of something we're going to do in the world, even though we may sort of, I may look down on you or you may be looking down on me, in engaging in linguistic interaction, we're actually almost recognizing each other as equals, in the sense that we're recognizing our ability to understand language, to understand what is being meant, and to actually sort of come to a consensus about what is even being desired and what we are going to do, or even to come to a consensus about the way the world is, right? Whether it's sunny outside, or, you know, whether, I don't know, the crops need to be moved out of the rain, right? If you think about sort of in slave societies, right? There's almost this assumption that just the fact that the master talking to the slave is assuming that the slave can understand language is already a recognition of that slave as being more than an animal, right? As being a sort of linguistic being who has the same potentials. And those things obviously in real life often aren't realized, but Habermas sees that inherent democratizing, liberating potential in language. And the point is to sort of progress almost for him is an ever greater realization of that implicit, assumed equality that lies within language itself, getting translated into social and political relations, right? So I think that in some sense, people have misunderstood the ideas that he has in philosophy, that he's just applying them directly and not recognizing the fact that they are not realized in practice. But he does recognize that. But he's still saying that language gives us these essential assumptions that sort of allow us that just as long as we're communicating linguistically and not using force, we are still actually almost at a level of equality, and there is a chance that a better argument may win out. Right now, obviously, he's well aware, and he provides us a whole, in theory of communicative action, a whole extended analysis of what he calls strategically motivated action, right? And that is where I'm using language not to actually try to reach consensus about the world, but to manipulate you in various ways, right? And where I'm not trying to tell the truth and I'm violating some of the implicit assumptions of language. So again, he's very aware of all that, but he still thinks that language at its very core has this kind of liberating, equal impulse. But as I said, as a public intellectual, he was well aware that that was not how language worked. He was often attacked. He even referred to the public sphere as chaotic and wild, and talked about the acid bath of public debate, and how often he had been burned by it. So in that sense, he knew that that was not how things actually functioned. And I think anybody who's actually been in a sort of philosophy seminar when things get heated knows that that's not even the way a philosophy seminar often functions. But I think that sort of separating sort of the implicit or the analysis of what is sort of inherent in language from kind of then the awareness of what the real world is actually like. Again, I think that that kind of mediation that Habermas gives us between, in some sense, the ideal and the real is what is so powerful about his philosophical analysis.
But just to sort of play some of that argument again. So I can understand that, just using language, as it were, there is a kind of, to use the kind of Kantian terminology, there's a set of preconditions for the possibility of language, and that set of presuppositions for the possibility of even speaking to one another involve assuming that, you're human, you can understand language, these are concepts that I'm using, you share them, we share a common understanding of what the world is roughly like. My voice isn't just a sort of causal effect on your eardrums. It carries meaning that you can interpret and all that sort of stuff. So that's all fine, and that, we can have a theory of language at its very basic is a sort of egalitarian game of that kind. But then given the way that language very quickly can be corrupted, right? And like power relations come into it. And as you said, people use language to manipulate people, to misinform people. And now again, if we bring it to the modern or contemporary situation where, large parts of social media, which again, people describe and have been describing, I don't know if people still think of X as the public square, but I mean, Twitter was referred to as the public square for a very long time. The vast majority of that is sort of bad faith conversation, is not people treating each other with respect or as equals and trying to convince them with a better argument. It is people trying to undermine people's sort of intellectual agency almost, right? By manipulating them and misleading them, bringing out propaganda, all that. So why isn't that the more important sort of aspect of language rather than the thing that Habermas finds in its foundation?
I think sort of the reason, more important or less important. I think
more defining, yeah.
I think it is for him. The point is that it's almost a parasitic form of language, right? This kind of strategic manipulative form. Because in order for that to work, you have to have the idea that we all speak the same language, that we have the common concepts, that we've recognized each other as equal beings that can understand language equally, right? They can both speak the language, that can even sort of ask questions to make sure that we understand what's happening, right? Where the slave can confirm, okay, you want that bale of hay moved over there, right? And so it's also almost in some sense that the strategic aspects of language don't function without having the kind of communicative equality aspects first, right? So they're parasitic of them. And so that's why I think that that's the essence of it. But more importantly, is that that Habermas really thinks that the only way to combat these parasitic strategic uses of language is through language itself and by highlighting sort of the ways that these things are manipulative. And that the only way to expose the manipulations is through language, right? And is to show, okay, look, this person is making this argument 5 minutes later, 5 minutes before they were making this other argument. And look, there's something inconsistent about that, or this appears to be sort of in their economic interest, right? But it's not really in the interest of all of us, right? So the only way, in some sense, to combat these strategic uses of language is to try to is linguistically, and is to try to reassert these kind of more, I guess, purer forms of language, or sort of these forms of language that are actually oriented towards mutual understanding, right? Towards Verständigung, right? So that in some sense, language is all we have. And if we abandon language and move to force or sort of physical violence, that's actually almost a step back, and that's less likely to actually lead us to form sort of the kinds of communities that we would want to live in, right? So in that sense, I think that's also getting at why he was in some sense very skeptical of revolutions and of sort of violence in general, and also of whether it came from the left or the right, where he really saw violence, these kind of non-linguistic forms of action, as actually being almost regressive in their very essence, because they were actually going to make it harder to reestablish linguistic interaction of this kind of better variety. So I think that's Kant had a very different kind of basis for his theory, but the worry about being able to reestablish the law after revolution, and thus and as a result of that, rejecting revolution, I think Habermas very much shares that Kant.
Mm.
Except for him, it's less about the law and more about sort of this ability of language to actually be a form of real communication.
Yeah. I mean, one more pushback, and then I'll let it go. So, to bring it to the president, I mean, we have as the president of the United States, probably one of the people that manipulate and use language in the kind of most bad faith ways that someone can imagine a political leader doing so. And there is a school of thought that says, well, what we need to do is just point out the inconsistencies and show that he's incoherent. And, one day he said this, and then the other day he said that. And of course, that's happened, for the last decade or so since, his first presidency and after, when he was no longer president, and including the present moment. A critic of Habermas would say, look, it's just not working. Like, we've tried this. We've all been doing this, in good faith, writing these articles saying, like, well, how can he say this? This is contradictory, incoherent. It doesn't seem to have an effect. People still like him, still vote for him. And the alternative is, well, we need to fight with the same tools, and we need to play dirty and use language and memes and this kind of more manipulative social media kind of way, rather than play by the rules, if you like. So maybe that would be someone like Gavin Newsom, for example, would take a less Habermasian kind of charitable approach to, pointing out the inconsistencies and putting forward the arguments for why this is, a problem, and just trying to use the same tools, but trying to make, in favor of a different point. So what would be the response from Habermas if someone said, look, we've tried this, it doesn't work?
I think sort of at the level of his work as a public intellectual, it's interesting, right, that Habermas displays a quite high tolerance for kind of conflict, and he actually does, get involved in these kind of very personal debates, and sort of, even violates some of his own rules, right, in terms of sort of, engaging in name calling. And he's actually a very good labeler, right? A lot of these kind of labels that he had, about times, and even sort of labeling people as, the new conservatives and things like that. So he's actually very good at taking advantage of these kind of, in some sense, strategic uses, right, of these kind of labels, or using the same tools back again. So in that sense, I think he recognized that in political debate, it wasn't always going to be nice, right? And he even talks about sort of, as I said, being burned by the acid bath of public discourse, or even sort of having the sense that he and his public contributions didn't need to sort of wrapping angry citizens in gauze, right? That sort of, if people were engaging in this way, that they you didn't necessarily need to sort of be nice to them, that you could sort of fire back. I don't think that changes the fundamental analysis. And I think precisely the Trump point gets at sort of precisely the problem. Whereas I think sort of if we were reading Trump's speeches in a newspaper, they are incoherent, right? He never finishes his sentences. The clause, sort of one clause runs into another clause that has nothing to do with the previous one, right? The sentences never really end. I think if that's the way we experience Trump, he would not have been as successful, right? The problem is that the medium of television and with these big rallies, right, it's precisely in these kind of areas that are the space of appearances, right? That's where Trump's charisma comes through. It's not in the rational argumentation, right? So in some sense, that would be a call for trying to reassert a different kind of public sphere, and a different kind of public domain. And I mean, there have been philosophers that have thought about ways of doing this, right? About almost, creating sort of almost public interest social media, right? Or something like that. In the same way that there were public interest television, right, or forcing social media to cover a certain amount of news, right, in the same way that broadcast networks were forced to do in the US in sort of the early era of television. I think there's all sorts of ways that we could think about to sort of reassert a kind of better public sphere that is more about argumentation and less about appearance. And again, I think precisely the point for Habermas is that as long as we're engaged, that sort of the way to fight against these sort of violations of kind of the, I guess, more democratic, liberating aspects of language, the only way to do it is linguistically, right? If I sort of not only fight back using the same tools, but then go beyond that and start using physical tools of violence, then sooner or later we're going to end up in a totalitarian sphere where we no longer have language, and it's all about the physical violence, right? And Habermas, given his own experiences as a youth growing up in the Nazi regime, right, that was exactly what he wanted to avoid. So in some sense, as long as we are in the linguistic sphere and are not sort of regressing below that, that's already in some sense an achievement. And then when we are in the linguistic sphere, there's always the possibility of using language to push back against these things. In some sense, that's the only way.
That's all we have. Yeah.
It's all we have. Yeah. I mean, it's more likely that I'm going to convince you that you're wrong, that I'm through language, that I am going to do it by torturing you, right? Or by engaging in physical violence against you, right? So in that sense, it's all we have. And we need to sort of maintain our faith that eventually good faith argumentation will win out in the long term, right? But again, right, I mean, Keynes famous argument.
Back to Kant, yeah. And sort of how far that arc is bent.
Yeah. And it is about political judgment as well, right? I mean, that's, I think, not something that Habermas would deny.
Yeah. Okay, I had a few more questions, but I think we also need to get to our Q&A from our audience. So Michael Camiola has an interesting question about tea houses and coffee houses. Says that if the public sphere began in salons and tea houses, what about China? China had tea houses for thousands of years. Why didn't they cause the same kind of social change that European ones did?
Yeah, so I mean, neither I nor I think Habermas are experts in sort of the Chinese tea house and how it functions. So I'll put that caveat out front. But I think the key thing for Habermas is that, right, it's not only sort of about the meeting over sort of a caffeinated beverage. It's also sort of, in some sense, there are broader social conditions at the time, right? Habermas, in the early pages of Structural Transformation, makes a big deal out of the fact that this is the early age of capitalism. And though I think sort of a lot of leftist theorists, right, see capitalism as just an unadulterated evil, for Habermas, it really is something that is good in the sense that what capitalism does is it gives everyone in society a stake in sort of economic issues. And as a result of that, they have to become interested in sort of states' foreign policies, in what's happening on the other side of the world where the tea is growing, right? In the weather in China or in India where tea is growing, if they want to sort of drink their tea at home or sort of act as merchants for tea. And it's those social conditions of early capitalism that play part of the role. Like rising literacy rates also, right? So there are all these kind of external conditions that make this possible. If you just have a bunch of upper class aristocrats meeting in a tea house, that's not going to be enough to generate this kind of change that Habermas wants. Similarly, right, if you have a bunch of illiterate farmers having tea sort of, I don't know, before they go out to work the fields, without having these without being literate and having these these early newspapers, right, that are sort of allowing them to join into conversations that are linked up with sort of other areas or other tea houses, right? That's again not going to be enough to generate this sense of the public. So there are all these kind of sociological and historical preconditions that really allow the coffee houses and tea houses of this era to generate a public sphere in this way. I think the interesting question is, have there been similar moments in time in other areas other than those that Habermas analyzed that played a similar function? And I think it's quite possible that there were. But you would also, again, have to have these same kind of socioeconomic preconditions in place in order for them to really generate the public sphere in the sense that Habermas is interested in it.
Yeah, so maybe a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the development of a democratic culture. So Nita Sarkar asks something on how Habermas understood power differentials. She said, you used master-slave a couple of times. Humans have lived in hierarchical and equal power relations. Would you say that Habermas is idealistic about and a bit myopic in his writings on communicative democracy that seem more aspirational rather than a critical analysis of current realities of power struggle? So that's kind of back to this critique that this is utopian thinking. It's not really real politics.
I think in some sense it's both, right? In the sense that, I think I've used the master slave a lot, and I'm thinking in that sense a lot of sort of Hegel's own analysis of the dialectic between the master and the slave, or sometimes it's called the Lord, right? The Lord and serf. Herr und Knecht in the original German is actually probably closer to Lord and serf. And so I think in that sense, right, I mean, Hegel's own diagnosis is really interesting because it is in some sense about understanding the real condition of the master and the slave, but also showing that that relationship does contain certain potentials for the very overcoming of that relationship. And I think in that sense, Habermas is very similar, or his analysis of language is very similar in the sense that he's aware that there are power differentials, that language in the real world is short, the linguistic communication in the real world is short-circuited in all sorts of ways. But he's aware of that reality, but he's also trying to say that there is the potential within language for overcoming that. And so in that sense, right, the real and the ideal are always standing in this kind of in tension with each other. And it's also about sort of understanding what the pathways out of that are, and recognizing that sort of there is this kind of potential in language to overcome these realities, and that we don't actually need to be engaging in violence, and we can be engaging in almost what Habermas calls a kind of radical reformism, right? That just by engaging in communicative practices, we can actually change the way the world functions, right? And you could think of all sorts of cases of that politically, right? I mean, Habermas often talked about the civil rights movement in the US, right? You can think about any other number of other areas, right? Even the sort of in the development of post-war Germany, where actually it is possible through communication and through debate to actually change the views that people have, on various social groups, whether it's sort of women, whether it's LGBTQI issues or anything else. Obviously those things, there's usually been violence involved in those recognitions. But in order for that violence, or for sort of to learn from that violence, there's always been this linguistic component about arguments and about forcing people to recognize others who they thought of as somehow less than human as being their equals and as being equal participants in public debate. And that's in some sense when you recognize that someone has been given that status or has won these debates, is when they are able to sort of participate in a public debate freely from their own point of view, right? Both in this kind of sphere of opinion formation, this kind of informal public sphere, but then also when they start to get elected to parliaments and become part of the kind of formal public sphere that actually is creating law.
A few more questions. I want to combine two, and then maybe we'll leave it at that. So there's one question about, given the fragmentation of philosophy and of knowledge in general, as Habermas says, philosophers have to kind of accept this context and work within it. And Phil Cade asks, what have philosophers like Habermas been doing to carry their ideas forward and compete with the world of the spectacle and influencers and become more relevant and reach more people? So that's the first. The second one is about whether there are any other public intellectuals cut in the same cloth as Habermas. And that maybe brings it a little bit in touch with the Axel Honneth comment about, not is this a dying breed, but has this breed died with Habermas, last week? Are people today in the environment that we live in, with the educational context and, the kind of intellectual traditions that we live in, are public intellectuals like this possible, and if so, how do they compete with the spectacle?
I mean, I think competing with the spectacle is obviously very difficult. I think Habermas was very successful at it, both because he was able to establish a certain kind of authority, but also, as I said, he was very good at, coming up with these turns of phrase that work their way into public discourse, right? So you say something like the unforced force of the better argument, or the new obscurity, or all these kind of phrases that he would coined to understand public debate, or even, sort of calling someone a new conservative, right? Those are phrases in the German public sphere that everyone understands and that everybody's heard of, primarily because of Habermas, right? So in some sense, he was quite good at this, in that sense, at competing through these kind of coinages of ideas and bringing his ideas across. It's not to say he won out in the debates oftentimes, and in fact, I think most of the times he didn't. But he was quite good at least forcing people to debate him and to sort of engage with his ideas and with his perspectives. In terms of, are there other people who fit this model? I certainly think that sort of in the German context, yes, right, there were other people that were debating and sort of engaging in similar projects. I think somebody like Gunter Grass would be an example. And there are, probably other people that we could mention as well. The problem is, again, right, we're probably mostly talking about older figures because the kind of structural conditions have changed and the public sphere has changed. I think so if you think about kind of younger influencers, right, that's a very different kind of world. And even sort of political commentators, right, that's very different. For Habermas, it's very important that the public intellectual is not someone who lives from the public sphere, right? They don't live off of kind of honoraria or off of cliques, right? So they don't have to generate debate or sort of be provocative in order to earn their living, right? But that they're actually they have a stable income, and they're actually they actually want the good of the public sphere itself, right? And of the democracy itself. So in that sense, anybody who's making their living being a commentator, for Habermas, in some sense, is already suspect, right? Because they kind of have to be controversial. They have to sort of be generating interest in order to sort of keep earning their living. So for him, it's very important that this is what he calls, he says, a Nebenberuf, which is literally a secondary vocation. But I think in today's words, we'd call it a side hustle, right? That it shouldn't be the kind of main way that you are generating your economic well-being, because that then means that you have an economic interest in sort of being out front, rather than having the interest being primarily about defending the public sphere. So I think that's probably the difference also between Habermas and, a lot of these other figures that we would think about today, whether it's long-form podcast or, somebody like Joe Rogan, or even, sort of the kind of new philosophical guru of the right, somebody like a Jordan Peterson, who I think is very much in the sphere of appearances, right, and very rarely actually appears in textual form. Right? I mean, he does write books occasionally, but that's not primarily what he's known for, right? He's primarily known for these clips, right, where he's dressed up in these kind of extravagant outfits and sort of telling men how to be men, right? That's a very different kind of model than the one that Habermas is advocating for.
Of course, newspapers and magazines are commercial endeavors, and so even if the people not writing for them are full-time kind of commentators, the platforms and the publications that they write for have to play that attention game today and compete with those. So I guess that also plays into the distortion of who gets published and whose view gets amplified, and controversies, I believe, something that even legacy newspapers are quite excited about.
Yeah, exactly.
From time to time. And I wonder whether Habermas's appeal in some ways was that he was just not playing at all that game and was from that kind of older world, and so sort of generated that level of respect, and people would pause and listen to what he had to say.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that whether or not people agreed with Habermas, and as I said, most of the time people didn't, I think it was clear to everyone that in some sense he wasn't he wasn't intervening because of his own well-being or because he needed to do it, right, in order to get paid an honorarium or anything like that, right? In many ways, it would have been easier for him just to sort of remain in the ivory tower and write his books, which were much acclaimed, and sort of engage in the university seminars, right, and not sort of subject himself to this kind of public scrutiny and to these kind of polemics that were then leveled against him because of his interventions. But I think it was always for him this sort of real need to defend the achievements of German democracy and increasingly sort of the achievements of the kind of post-World World Order that, despite its flaws, he saw as having genuinely sort of made the world a better place. And sort of, in the sense of pushing back against totalitarianism, encouraging democracy, encouraging human rights, right? Again, not to say that he thought it was the ideal world, but I think he definitely saw that it was something that it was worth fighting for. And that was also why later in his life, in his last years, he was so disappointed by what was happening and what he was seeing in the world, and almost sort of this kind of regression that he was seeing in the world, whether we're talking about democracy, whether we're talking about the return of war to Europe, in the form of sort of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or any number of other developments that he just found very worrying.
We've only scratched the surface of, Habermas's philosophy and his legacy. And thank you, Peter, for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Alexis, and thank you everyone for coming. It's been a lot of fun.